I received my PhD in early 2004 and immediately went into an academic position. I was there for several years and then decided to leave academics. And during that time that I was away, as Dr. Friedman mentioned, I was working in the nonprofit space for food banks, for the Clark County Local Foods Council, and for some other institutions associated with nutrition and health equity across a variety of different metrics. I like to say that when I decided to come back to academics, I think that experience that I had witnessing the way things were done, perhaps the way that I thought things could be done better in how academics and science and the medical field approached community partnerships and community support. And I wanted that to inform how I do the work that I do now. And so with that in mind, you can see that with even my FDA contract and the other grants that I have, including the one that I'm going to talk about today, I try to be really open to learning and to growing in the way that I approach the people that I have the privilege of working with and supporting in the things that they're already doing. And so I hope that what you notice about what I talk about is that there's sort of these common threads. I think that the work that we do in this area needs to be people-centered. I think it needs to be really holistic and transdisciplinary. And so when I say that, what does that mean? It means we do need the basic scientists, whether in nutrition or in chemistry or in medical sciences, but we also need social scientists, right? We need economists, we need psychologists, we need business experts, we need public health and political scientists to be involved so that we can have an integrative approach. And by working together across all of these disciplines, we can then have a greater and most importantly, long-lasting impact in the work that we're doing. And so I wanted to just kind of start off, and we'll just go through this quickly. Many of you have probably seen this. And in order to move quickly and get to talking about the project, you'll see that I've put QR codes on several of the slides so that you can go back and look at these documents on your own. But when we think about why do we need to think about food systems and transforming those food systems at the same time that we're talking about public health and the same time that we're talking about nutrition security, because they really are interrelated and important to one another. And so these are the latest statistics that came out just recently in the World Population Prospects of the United Nations, the 2002 report. And so we're expecting, we're about 7.6 billion right now. We're expecting in the next 10 years to increase to 8.6 billion. And then by 2050 to be at almost 10 billion people globally. The US Census, which is not pictured here, we're seeing similar growth. So we're expecting about 355 million people in 2030 and almost a little over 400 million by 2050, which is a 25% increase from 2016. And so we have a lot of people, right? And we know that as population grows, we have a decrease in the land available, right, to grow food in sort of traditional monoculture ways. And so we need to approach nutrition security and agriculture and food systems to find healthy, sustainable, and resilient, affordable and equitable ways to feed this growing domestic and global population. And so I think that we're seeing not only with the UN, with the World Health Organization, with the FAO, but also with the USDA, and we're starting to see it more even within the FDA and the NIH, this becoming a real priority for government institutions and NGOs. And so I also wanted to talk a little bit about some terminology. And so you can see, if you get a chance, The Economist in July of this year put out a great film, a little short film, and an article called Why Food Security is a Global Threat. And for time's sake, I'm not going to show it here, but I did put the QR code. And so I can make sure that you have access to that. But it is really a great watch that talks about the costs associated with global and domestic nutrition and security, and why, even if we are not personally affected by it or the individuals that we work with are affected by it, why we all should care, right, as a global and domestic society. And so a lot of what we hear is food security. And food security, when we're talking the FAO or the UN, is really based on this food insecurity experience scale. And so you can see there's a range here from mild food insecurity all the way up to severe food insecurity. And then you'll also hear terms in these reports, like the one listed here, the Food Security Report from 2022. You'll hear the term percent of the population that is hungry or percent of the population that is undernourished. And I think it's really easy to get some of those terms confused. And so I wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page moving forward about what we're talking about. And so when we talk about food insecure, okay, severely food insecure over on this end, which is also what is referred to as hungry or undernourished. Okay, that's all going to be over on this far right end here. I don't know if you can see my pointer. Over on this far right side here. And so when we talk about that, we're saying that this person, most likely multiple times a year, has run out of food and gone at least an entire day without eating, okay? But then we also have a large number of individuals that are in this moderate food insecurity. So that's going to be people who maybe they can't say that specifically they've run out of food for an entire day, but maybe they're making very difficult choices about spending money on food or spending money on electric bills, right? Or on rent. Maybe they're having to make choices about skipping meals. We see this a lot with parents that will skip meals so that their children can have food in homes that are moderately food insecure. And so just to give you some numbers, in 2019, about 8% of the global population was considered undernourished. And so remember, that's way over here, that are missing one or more days per year of meals, an entire day without any food. In 2020, that jumped to 9.3%. And the thought at that time was, well, this is because of COVID, there's supply issues, right? That's why we're seeing this significant jump within 1 year. Unfortunately, in 2021, we continued to see a rise. And when the 2021 numbers came out, we were still at almost 10%. So even with supply issues starting to come back online, we're still seeing an increase. And then when we think about things happening globally, like the war in Ukraine, right, we know that continued climate change, continued political unrest around the world are going to continue to cause these numbers to rise. And so once again, kind of the purpose about talking about this is what I'm sure is really just telling you what you already know, but it's important that we're thinking and that we're talking about food security. And then I want to move beyond just talking about food security to this term of nutrition security or nutrition insecurity. And so when we talk about food security, we are talking about calories. Historically, it's our people having access to calories and food. But I think most of us in this room, right, would look at the data and we know that calories are not the same thing as nutrients. We know that data exists to show that at the same time, right, morbid obesity and different chronic diseases associated with diet are happening at the same time, right, as malnourishment. And so nutrition security takes it a step further and says it's not just about providing calories for survival, it's about providing food that has appropriate nutrient value for quality of life. And that's really where we've started heading in the last 5 or 10 years. And then so to add to those numbers that we already talked about, okay? And I did mention this, but I want to go ahead and say it. In 2021, almost 30% of the global population, so 2.5 billion people, were moderately or severely food insecure. That's a huge number. That's almost a quarter, well, almost a third of our population in the world. And so, and then when you add to that, almost 3.1 billion people worldwide couldn't afford a healthy diet. So again, it goes beyond calories and talking about nutrient density. And then, so with that in mind, when we're talking about sort of global priorities, the UN has come up with these sustainable development goals. And there are 17 of them, okay? And so the focus of these 17 sustainable development goals are to end hunger, to achieve food security and improve nutrition, and to promote sustainable agriculture. So some of the components of that goal are ending hunger, ensuring access of all people to safe foods, ensuring sustainable food production systems, et cetera. And then in 2021, the UN Secretary General convened a food systems summit. And as a way to sort of say, okay, we have these 17 sustainable goals, how do we reach them? And they came up with these action tracks in order to achieve those. And what I think is important to point out is that they're not siloed, right? And so I think historically, in medicine, in science, and nutrition, we've acted in silos, right? So we have dietitians that are sort of focused on how can we feed people in a way that promotes health. You have nutrition science that's doing the research to then inform that. We have community workers that are working with community members, right? We have physicians that are working in their offices. We have economists that are looking at things from this really high bird's eye view, right? We have social scientists that are thinking about things differently. But if you look at these action tracks, right, we can see that they have to be transdisciplinary in order for us to truly meet the needs of our domestic and global population. We have to do it in a way in order to be sustainable and impactful that pays attention to natural resources and how to protect them, right? That makes sure that whatever actions that we're taking are equitable and distributed to everybody and not just to those who can afford the highest level nutrition as they're currently priced. We have to think about things across the entire value chain. So how do the policies that we're making and the suggestions that we're making not only affect end consumer users, but also the farmers and producers, right? The retailers along the way, so that everybody is able to benefit from the actions that we're taking. And so that brings us all to the social determinants of health. And so you probably have all seen this. This is, I think it's the same picture that they had in Healthy People 2020, but this is from Healthy People 2030. And I want to point out how the work that I try to do, and that I'm sure everybody who's attending tries to do, we really need to address multiple social determinants of health, again, in order to have sustainable impacts. We know that just providing food does not ensure that people's diets change. We know that just providing education does not ensure that people are able to eat healthy food in order to improve their health. And so as an example of this, both the SUSHI project that I'll talk about in a few minutes and also one of the other projects that I'm working on really work to address community health and food systems and agriculture in holistic ways that touch on all of this. For example, one of the projects that I'm working on, it's in a small, low resource community outside of Dayton, and we are providing, through community economics and development, we're providing training for new farmers on micro farms. And so we provide the land, we provide certificate training, and we provide mentorship to these new farmers that want to grow vegetables. And this land is right in a communal area where we know that the community members gather on a regular basis. And so that's going to be touching on economic stability, right? By providing opportunities for people to increase income and stimulate the economic environment, as well as increasing access to locally grown produce. But in addition, we then help them build a farm market at that same location so that now you're increasing access, right, and you're building community context and social cohesiveness where people from the community get to come and meet their farmers, right? And so everybody is investing in the community. At those farm markets, our extension agents come in and bring their mobile food demonstration vehicle and provide demonstrations for how to utilize and make recipes from the local produce that's being developed. So now you're increasing health and nutrition literacy, you're increasing the number of people who are talking to each other within the community about their health and about nutrition. And so you're really addressing, you're addressing neighborhood and built environment, because now you've created this place where people are growing food, buying food, talking about food, right? And building that kind of environment where they can all support each other into being healthy. And so so again, kind of the first part of this was really to talk about the global and the domestic need for us to continue addressing food and nutrition insecurity, and how this is really a push both in governments and NGOs across the world, but also in the United States. And I was talking to Rachel before this started about how impressed I've been recently with the USDA. Out of all of the federal funding agencies, I have really seen in the RFAs that they're writing and in the types of projects that they're funding, that they are really dedicated to this transdisciplinary and integrative approach to transforming food systems, to protecting the climate, and also to making sure that individuals and communities are receiving equitable access to nutrient-dense foods. And so to give an example of that, this is just some of the wording that is in the most recent 2022 Sustainable Agriculture Systems RFA. And so as you can see, you're seeing that they are considering the growing population, they're talking about nutrition security and safety, but they're addressing it about natural resource availability, climate change, the economy, et cetera. And so that brings me to the SUSHI project. So the Sustainable Agriculture Systems grant funded for 5 years the SUSHI project. And so one of the requirements is that it's transdisciplinary, like we talked about, and that it is integrated. So it has research and education and extension or outreach components that all seek to meet this goal of food systems transformation for the purpose of nutrition and food translation and security in communities. And so the research part of our project is looking at aquaculture and how we can make aquaculture a more economically viable and environmentally sustainable system. And so you might say, well, why aquaculture? So the United States is pretty behind when it comes to aquaculture. Aquaculture, both marine-based and land-based, is very, very popular and common as a food production system across the rest of the world, especially in the Middle East. When I think about like Turkey and some of those places, they've been doing this for a very long time. And so when we look at the most recent dietary guidelines for Americans, we have those guidelines saying, hey, everybody needs to eat more fish, a couple servings at least a week, because we have these, it's a great protein source. We've got this great balance of heart healthy fatty acids, wonderful. But then we have the EPA and the FDA appropriately saying, whoa, 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 whoa. We need to be really careful when we're thinking about eating fish, because we have contamination of water sources, right? That translates into fish, things like PCBs and phthalates and heavy metals, et cetera. And so there's this really conflicting information to the public about what they should be eating for their health. And so we have that. And then on the other side, we have one of the most expensive ingredients and least economically sustainable ingredients for fish feed, especially some of those higher value fish that have the best heart healthy fatty acid components in them, is fish meal and fish oil, which is still typically wild caught in not the most sustainable way. And so there's a huge push right now looking at how we can alter feeds, right, within aquaculture environments to maintain a good fatty acid profile in the final product, the fish, while also doing it in a way that is more economical for producers and more environmentally sustainable. And so there's lots of different people doing lots of research, but we wanted to look at hemp grain because hemp has a really wonderful macronutrient profile. It has one of the best in plants ratios of omega-3 to omega fats compared to like soy or corn or some of those other things that are typically used in animal feeds. And so unfortunately, hemp is not approved as a feed ingredient because there are concerns about potential cannabinoid or metabolites from cannabinoids. So things like CBD or THC that could potentially bioaccumulate, right, in livestock, including fish. And so we have about 5 years of trials planned where we can provide all of that data to the FDA and AAFCO, who determines feed ingredient safety. And what we expect will happen is that we can show that it is in fact a safe feed ingredient and then be able to provide that opportunity for increasing domestic markets of hemp grain, which would help both human consumption as well as the aquaculture market. The other reason we like aquaculture is that unlike some of the other flesh-based production systems, it tends to have a better environmental footprint overall. There are still some problems with it that people are working on, things like water quality and how can you maintain that and deal with how to do that in a sustainable and healthy way. But for the most part, blue foods are considered to have a lower environmental footprint, even land-based aquaculture that would require water input than something like beef or even chicken production. And what I personally like about it is that you can produce a lot of fish in a pretty small system. So when I think of urban environments, right, where there may not be a lot of space, but there's things like empty parking garages, right, or that kind of thing, this idea that you could potentially build a system like this in a community, right, and be able to have really healthy protein, heart healthy fat producing fish. And if you're doing aquaponics, produce, right, in a small space for a large number of people. And so all of that really just made sense to us, right, to do aquaculture and then to find ways to make it even more environmentally sustainable and economically viable for different people. And so another big thing that we wanted to do was look at increasing diversity, not only in aquaculture, where there's a huge lack of women and people of color, especially in leadership positions, but also in agriculture in general. And so we know that our agriculture workforce is aging, so we don't have as many young people that are coming into it. And it has always been a very white male dominated, not always, but since enslavement ended, it has been a very white male dominated, especially in positions of leadership and power. And so we wanted to provide opportunities to train minority students, Native Americans and Black students in particular in agriculture areas. And so we have several $1 million of that $10 million is in scholarships where Native Americans can complete their bachelor's degrees in a number of agri-STEM fields and then enter the workforce. And then we're also working closely with the College of Menominee Nation, which is, and I'll talk about the Menominee Nation in a while. So the scholarships are primarily to them and then also opened up to other tribal communities in their surrounding area. And then the majority of the outreach work that we're doing is through College of Menominee Nation in the Menominee tribe itself. We're building 2 aquaculture facilities. One is an outreach aquaponics facility, and the other is an aquaculture facility so that they can expand their research, which makes them more fundable and then able to partner with other minority serving institutions with this goal of sort of the domino effect, right, of we leverage what we have to help them build, and then they leverage what they have to build others around them. So hopefully with this ever-expanding expansion, it's a lot of E's there, for equity in education and research and that sort of thing. And so in addition to that work, we're doing some nutrition programming, et cetera, there. So we have Central State University, we have Kentucky State University, who are leading the feeding trials. They have a huge aquaculture program there. It's another HBCU, 1890. the College of Menominee Nation, which is on the reservation. And then we have 3 economists, 1 in production, 1 in consumer, and 1 in ecosystem services from University of Kentucky, Arkansas, and Mississippi State, respectively. And so you can see here, we have people that are in aquaculture, people that are in nutrition and biomedical sciences, people that are experts in extension and outreach and education, as well as economists to make this a transdisciplinary team. So I've already talked about kind of the objectives and the tasks that we have. And so now I want to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing in Menominee. So the Menominee Reservation, as you can see here, is about 235,000 acres, about 45 miles northwest of Green Bay, Wisconsin. It shares coterminous or identical borders with Menominee County. But I think it's really important to note that they were the original people that had been living there and have been living there consistently for over 10,000 years. And originally, they had 10 million acres in Wisconsin and in Michigan. And through a series of treaties that occurred, their land was systematically taken from them and given over to other tribal communities that had been forced to move east and north from other areas. And this includes the Oneida and the Stockbridge-Munsee tribes that received that ceded land. Not only was their land taken away, but when they finally said no, no more, the Menominee Termination Act occurred in response to that in the 1950s, which abolished their reservation and eliminated their Indian identity. This was an experiment that didn't happen with a lot of tribes, but it did with them to force those tribes to join the mainstream in an assimilation attempt. The Menominee were singled out specifically for termination because the tribe was self-sufficient with their forestry and other projects, and they were progressive in the eyes of the federal government. And so in their own words, the once proud Menominee people were reduced to severe poverty. They lost their tribal lands and assets and were effectively prevented from any efforts towards self-determination. And I think when we think about a lot of the communities that we work with, whether that's African-American descendants of enslaved people, whether that is Hispanic people that have migrated from Central and South America from political unrest that we caused as the United States, or whether we're talking about Native American tribes across, it's easy, and unfortunately too often it has been said that people in those communities are unhealthy because of choices they make, right? That's often the indoctrination that we hear, and certainly what I was taught in medical school, and you need to change behavior in order to change health. And I think now, thankfully, we're really viewing things more from a systemic and structural racism and genocidal, if you will, view. And that's really how I approach this work. And so the current status, because of what I just talked about, is that out of 72 counties in Wisconsin, they are ranked 72 for public health outcomes and food and nutrition security. There's a significant lack of employment opportunities. They state that less than half of the tribal members are able to live on the reservation because of the lack of employment opportunities that exist. What's really cool is that for a long time, the Menominee Nation were viewed as hunters and gatherers. But not long ago, they had an archaeological find in various areas that showed that the Menominee Nation had been doing community agriculture for centuries. And not only that, but they were using things like biochar and fish emulsion from their sturgeon hunts every year in order to fertilize and have these wonderful community agriculture. And so it's really sort of excited, right, and revitalized the community's ideas about what food sovereignty means to them, who they are, what their identity is in relationship to the land, not only as hunters, gatherers, and fishers, but also as agriculturalists. And so I pulled this from a project that they're doing on food sovereignty. And I love it. It says the Menominee Nation describes food sovereignty as living our traditional Menominee ways, identity, values, and relationships to provide a tribally sustained community food system for future generations. It's about reconnecting to the land and rediscovering growing practices that are in tune with the environment. It's about revitalizing rich cultural traditions tied to seasonal growing and gathering practices. It's about nutrition and health, reversing a tide of unhealthy eating resulting from the loss of land, nutritious foods, and traditional life ways. And so when I first started talking with Menominee Nation, I approached it, and they will tell you this, and I said, I have this idea. I want to apply for this grant. I want you to be a part of it. I've read about you. I think that what y'all are doing is within the same vein as what I'm passionate about, and I'm not going to apply unless you will join me as a partner. And they liked that. And apparently they took that really seriously, and we joined. And my purpose this entire time has been, they're already doing this great work. How can I leverage money and resources to just support the work that they're already doing? And I think that really, to me, is the core of what true community-centered work is. It's the people who have power, right? Power that we shouldn't even have, quite frankly, right? Because it's systems and structures that have given many of us power and privilege that we didn't earn, right? But it's just been passed down because of the systems and structures in place. How can those of us who have any level of privilege and power leverage what we have to support the work that has already been going on, right, by the individuals in the communities themselves? And then secondly, I think it's really important to think about how we are guided in our work, right? And so for me, what that ends up looking like is, who am I giving the power to, right? So when I say that I'm doing community needs assessments or community forums, and I'm simply sitting down and taking information, but then ultimately I'm deciding what happens, or my team is deciding what happens, or am I actually making community members part of the decision-making body? And so you'll see that on our external advisory boards, we have people from the community that are on them with actual voting power, significant voting power. We don't make any steps in the Menominee community without input and guidance from the tribal elders, right, as well as the community at large. And so, so our motivation, like I said, for working with this community is that Native Americans have higher food insecurity. We know that targeted and community-centered programming can improve nutrition. We know that equitable and culturally relevant programs are needed in historically excluded and disadvantaged populations. And we knew that the work was already happening. And so quite frankly, it was easy to come alongside and say, how can we support you in what you're doing? You tell us what you need and you tell us what you want, and we're going to make it happen in a way that works for you. And so our overall objectives, right, are to support them in food sovereignty. And so this specific work is looking at what is their desired education and programming needs. And then also we're providing education not only to individuals, consumers, but also to producers. And we're providing funding for 6 new certificate graduates from a certificate program that we're creating in aquaponics. We're providing funding for 6 new startups within that community that will help to provide fish and produce for the community itself, but then also have excess that they can sell, and will connect them with other people in the value chain, restaurants, grocery stores, et cetera, outside the community, that will then once again provide more economic stimulus to the Menominee Reservation. So what we expect will happen is that there'll be more production, right, of fish and produce on the reservation, and that combined with the programming and the investment and excitement from the community will lead to increased nutrient consumption. And then ultimately all of those things together are helping this community and the work that they're doing toward being sustainable and sovereign in their food production and the choices that they're able to make. And so the first thing that we did, which we just recently finished, was to conduct focus groups to determine the community perspective on food security, sovereignty, aquaponics. What do they know about it? Do they want it on the reservation? What are they excited to grow? The next step that we're working on right now is building the aquaponics facility. And then we expect in the spring and summer, we'll have our first field days, food distributions that will come out of that. We've already partnered with the local food bank and the diabetes clinic to be able to distribute the fish and the produce that are produced in the extension facility towards to the most vulnerable people in the community, while the aquaponics producers will be able to produce it for those that can afford it. So we wanted to make sure that everybody, right, those who can afford it and those who wouldn't be able to afford it for a variety of reasons, would have access to the healthy fish and produce that are now going to be available in the community. And so for the community forums, we originally planned these to be all in-person facilitated interview style forums. They had another outbreak of COVID right after we started this. And so we had to cancel many of those, and we had to switch sort of to more of open-ended survey questions that we had to that we validated. So we did a combination of both in-person facilitated interview style events, as well as where we passed out these open-ended surveys and had them complete them. We had these at the Community Computer Center. We had them at the different powwows where there's a large population of people. We have them at the farmers market every week. And what we ended up finding out was that the majority of people, as you can see here, right, in the dark blue, green, and yellow, knew very little to nothing about aquaponics. And there were very few that had heard of it or had a good idea of what it was. So we knew, but they were excited. Once we explained what it was, they were very, very excited. I can tell you anecdotally, when I visited for a week last summer, everywhere I went, the grocery store, the farmer's market, the powwow, people would say, oh, who are you? Where are you from? I said, oh, I'm from Central State. I'm working with College of Menominee Nation on the aqua. And I couldn't even get the word aquaponics out. And people would start to gather and talk about how excited they were for this opportunity for their community to have this available, to learn and to be able to do certificate programs and to have fish and produce available right on the reservation. We found that about half of the community said that they knew somebody who had gone for a day or more without food over the past year. And so that just really reminds us and emphasizes what we already talked about, right? About being 72 out of 72 counties for community health. We also asked them, you know, if you could grow produce year round, what would you want to grow? And on the left, we had almost everybody said the ones on the left: tomato, corn, cucumbers, beans, and squash. I find it interesting that we have the three sisters on here: corn, beans, and squash. So culturally relevant foods, right, that are important to them. And then on the right, we see about a third or more people also said things like peppers, lettuces, herbs, berries, etc. And then we said from the list below, which ones would you like to see grown locally and available at the farmer's market? Again, about 80 to 90% said the ones on the far left: herbs, cucumbers, carrots, corn. We had about 50% in addition say the ones in the middle, things like peppers, asparagus, strawberries. And on the right, at least a third said cabbage, celery, and beans. And so you can see there's a great desire to have these highly nutrient-dense foods available in the local community. In addition to that, we also wanted to gather data outside of the community forums to guide what we were going to grow in the aquaponics facility. So rather than taking this approach of, well, everybody grows tilapia and lettuce, that's the easiest, we know how to do it, let's do it. We said, no, we want to know what the community wants, what they're going to eat, what's culturally relevant to them. And then it's our job to figure out new methods if we need to make sure that we can grow it, right, in aquaponics systems. And that's where the research comes in, right, to back up what those community desires are. And so we looked at farmers market sales data. We met with the elders to find out what things they would want. And there were some things that, like sage and tobacco and dill, that are used for ritual purposes, not just culinary needs that they wanted to grow. And then we also wanted to find out what kinds of programming people were interested in. And we found that they wanted Aquaponics 101. They wanted to learn how to can and preserve. They wanted to learn more about their cultural diets and how to incorporate those into their lives with the food that's available. And so, and then we also, this was kind of the coolest thing to me, because I mentioned tilapia and lettuce, right? That's what everybody does when they start aquaponics. Well, they didn't want that. They wanted bluegill and some very difficult things to grow. But like I said, you're not really community centered if you're guiding what you're doing based on what you think you should do, right? And not what the community says that they want to be done, right? And that they want to participate in. So we are going to start with bluegill and we are going to grow some lettuce because they did want that, but bluegill, which is a culturally a native species to the area that's important to them, and some other things that'll be interesting to do the research and determine how best to grow those things in an aquaponics facility. The other thing that I think was really important that we discovered through all of these surveys and community forums and meeting with the elders, et cetera, was that there were these 5 micro communities that exist. So on this reservation, there's Kashina, which is the seat of government. It's where the college is, it's where the food pantry is, it's where the clinic is. And so we were hearing a lot of things like, well, Kashina gets everything. Like these aquaponics facilities are going to be in Kashina, just like everything else. And we said, oh, this is really interesting. Like we need to explore this more. And so we identified these sort of 5 micro communities that have different demographics within them that have often felt as though they didn't have equitable access to the things that the reservation had made available to them. And so we have put into place very specific methods to ensure that when we do things like food distributions, we don't just expect everybody to come to Kashina, but we will actually be taking food and produce to each of these micro communities to ensure that things are equitably distributed. And we call it equity within equity, right? So it's not just, oh, we're helping to leverage food sovereignty in Menominee Nation, but within this community, how are we making sure that everybody, because there are micro communities in every community that we work with, how are we making sure that we are listening to everyone and ensuring truly equitable distribution, even within the specific communities that we're using? So I mentioned some of this desired programming, and people were wanting to learn how to utilize local and healthy foods for ancient and traditional recipes. And so we partnered with several different native chefs to do demonstrations at the farmers market. This is Lizette Bailey. She is an amazing native chef. This is her husband, JB, who they don't have chiefs anymore, but he comes from the line ancestrally of chiefs. They are both very dedicated. You can see here, this is her card. And so she talks about reconnecting her people's DNA to their ancestral foods, one meal at a time. And so we sought out these native chefs that could come in and connect with their community, right? And build again on that desire for social cohesiveness and building on ancestral knowledge and wisdom. And so we did a few of those this past summer, and we'll be doing them again every year at the farmers market. The next steps are, we also use the community forums to develop pre-post assessments that we'll be doing this spring and then in year 4 to determine across a variety of metrics how our interventions, whether that's here's our aquaculture and aquaponics facility being built there, and here's some of our team at Menominee, whether having fish available, whether having produce available actually increased or changed any behavior within the environment. We're working with the diabetes clinic to get aggregate data to see if we start to see any risk factors decreasing over 5 years and beyond, as we know that we have increased access and consumption of these foods. We're almost done constructing the aquaponics and aquaculture facilities. And again, what we're growing in them is fully guided by that input from the community at large, as well as the tribal elders. And then we're just working on finishing up and implementing the different programming that I have talked to kind of throughout, sprinkled in the presentation. And so that's what we're doing. I apologize, I went over, but this is our Twitter page that I'm not great at social media. I think as scientists, you know, at least me, I won't speak for everybody, but I never learned how to do any of this, but I tried to put different things we're involved in, different pictures of what's going on, and we hope to continue doing that more as programming set up. So thanks for having me. I apologize for going over, but I would love to hear any thoughts, questions, what you're doing, etc. From here on out. So thank you.
Great, that was fabulous. It does look like we have some accolades coming into the chat here. I think I do have one question, and just sort of, you know, your focus here with the Menominee community in Wisconsin. Do you see that what you're learning has opportunities for translation here in Ohio.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think, again, sort of the core elements here are, I think, humility, right? Authenticity. What is the power structure, right? As we're designing, implementing, and continuing on with these projects. And I think that if those of us in positions of privilege, right, approach the things we do from a real sense of humility, authenticity, and wanting to leverage what we have, but understanding that the data and what's written in articles is severely lacking, right? And what I love about the USDA RFA from this year is it said, I'm going to get the words wrong, but it's in the RFA. It says, we acknowledge traditional ecological, right, and community work, right, as valid for these projects. And that has never been done before. Never before has a federally funded agency said, we're not just talking about evidence-based, meaning what the gatekeepers have allowed through over the decades, but we know that there's work that works already happening in communities, already being done by the people that live there with almost no resources, right? And so to me, I think it's my job, it is our job for those of us that have resources, right, to simply approach and say, hey, what are you doing? What's working? How can we learn from you? And how can we leverage what we have to support the work that you're already doing? And so I like to move away from words like serving the community to supporting the work that's already happening. I know y'all do the same kind of thing in the work that you do. But yeah, I mean, I think this is relevant in urban communities. It's relevant in rural populations. I would love to see more aquaponics in whether it's Cleveland, right, Toledo, Columbus, Dayton, Cincinnati. I think that there's some really cool things we could do. And I hope that whatever model is developed here, that I can synergize, whether it's people, at Case, Ohio State, wherever, that we can try to do these things locally in Ohio for sure.
Yeah, awesome. And your comment reminds me, Larry Green, who's a population health scientist, probably in the 90s, has a paper of like, we need, let's move away from evidence-based practice and more to practice-based evidence. And
yes.
I do think there's receptivity to that, but it's very slow. But I think maybe the tide is turning and people are realizing that practice-based evidence is where it's at. So
yeah. Right. I mean, like I said, I'm really pleased with the USDA. I promise I'm not a shill for the USDA. I just really respect what they're doing. There's problems as well, but I think they've been really receptive to hearing about those problems. I think if you look at who's in leadership at the USDA right now, you look at Jewel Brenau, you look at the different people that are in NIFA, I think we're starting to see why, right? The USDA is moving in those directions. I want to see the same thing happen in NSF and in NIH. I feel like that ship is turning a little bit more slowly, but I hope, maybe I'm optimistic that it's sort of shifting a little bit that way as well, so that we can see more of these kind of transdisciplinary and as you said, as Larry Green said, practice-based evidence, right? In the approaches that we're taking and that sort of thing. So that's encouraging. Yes.
Question.
Thank you so much. Everything that you're doing is so inspiring and exciting to hear about. It's just like, yeah, it's really amazing. I'm curious, my question's kind of about like the hemp as feed component of your work. And I'm just wondering, like, if you find that it is like a safe input and economically viable, you shared about like the 6 certificates and the 6 startups, which seems like a really awesome like ramp to be able to continue that work. Like, what do you see as success? And like, I don't know, like either ongoing support or like ongoing impact of those two,
Sure.
like the certificates and the startups.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to combine yours with Marcus Greenome, by the way, who just wrote in the chat, is a member of the Menominee community. He is amazing. He has a nonprofit that focuses on some work that's going on there. And he was a co-witness with me giving testimony about hemp at US Congress in July. So he's phenomenal. If you don't know him, Google him and the work that he's doing. He's great, but he's kind of asking a similar thing, like, is there a plan to assure their sustainability for those facilities, right? And so as far as the producers, when you say, what is success, right? Well, success in the short term, which is in the life of the project, we want to get these up and running. We want to get them connected with retailers, right? So that they have an outlet to be able to sell their product, right? And that hopefully will continue sustainability. Right now, Marcus can write in the chat and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that right now, a lot of the fish that's coming into Menominee or grocery stores in the area are coming from Red Cliff up on the northern part, and then also the Potawatomi Nation has an aquaponics facility that they use to provide for their tribal members. And so I think that there's a place for, Red Lake fisheries. And so I think that there's a place for Menominee to carve out a niche, these producers, with their local and state retailers, grocery retailers, restaurants, et cetera, to kind of sustain it beyond the life of the project. Marcus's question is a little bit more difficult, talking about how do we maintain the aquaculture and aquaponics facility at College of Menominee Nation after it's done. And I think that's a really important question, and I don't fully have an answer, but I think that part of that is once you've built capacity, right? So it's the same way that we have, we sustain the different farms that we have here at Central State or at other land grants. Once you've built that capacity and you've shown the impact that it has, you then can approach land grant funders, right? The USDA, the federal and state governments, to provide continual annual support for that. So I think that's one aspect of it. And then as far as other things, I think that's a great question, actually, that I want to talk with Brian, and maybe Marcus, you could get involved in those discussions too, to see what other things are allowed in order to sustain it in non-federally funded ways. And so there are rules, right? So if you have something that's built on a land grant institution, there are rules about what can be patented or what can be sold from it or not sold from it. And so there's a lot of red tape to go through, but I think there's definitely avenues to explore in a variety of ways that can cause this to continue to be sustainable long after the life of the project. I would be very devastated if we did this work and it didn't sustain long after the life of the project, both educating and providing these new startups. It's a great question, though. It's really important. And part of why we have 3 economists on our team to address those exact questions.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, we have one final question in here and then we'll wrap it up. I know it took us a minute to get started, a very big, hard question. So maybe you have a closing thought, Brandy, and then we'll wrap up our final seminar for 2022.
Is this the one about how third world countries are finding it difficult to get a return of investment from their small farms and are instead getting more value from land by selling them? Any idea how to prevent it? That is incredibly hard. I wish that I had my economists here to talk about that, because that is certainly something outside of my range. But I will say, from a personal opinion, right, not as somebody who is specifically in that field, it comes down, I think, to policies. And as long as globally and domestically, we have agencies and government structures set up to support taking advantage of small producers and small farmers, to support larger corporations that do not have the same regard for natural resources, right, for equity, for fair labor practices, we're going to continue to see this. And so, not to be like everybody vote, but I do think that is part of our responsibility right, as people in this field is to use our voices in public policy spaces before Congress. You know, Dr. Friedman, you taught me that when I first contacted you about speaking before Congress, and you talked about how important that was for us. And I know you've done it several times. And so, and again, as Tim just mentioned, those USDA changes happen because of listening sessions and people pushing and saying, this is what needs to happen. And so I think both domestically and globally, and it can feel like an absolute uphill battle, but I think we need to pay attention to the small changes that have been made and continue fighting that good fight, because if we don't change policies, we're going to continue seeing exactly what Sanjaya said happens. And so we have to be approaching it holistically, also from how are we approaching public policy.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We will be posting a recording of our seminar along with the other seminars on the YouTube channel for Swetland. So that should be coming up in the next week. We greatly appreciate this opportunity. I mean, this is such a big, bold project, yet it's so connected and, you know, really people-centric. And so, and just amazing to have Mark here joining us as well, bringing in your perspective. So I appreciate everyone being here. Have a wonderful winter holiday season, and we look forward to reconnecting in 2023 for our new year of seminar. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Keep up the good work, everybody.